He defeated Arnold Schwarzenegger at a time when Arnold was young, hungry, and convinced he was unstoppable. He built a body so extreme that scientists still cannot fully explain how it happened. On the night he came closest to death, he was not in a gym and he was not on a stage. He was in his own home, bleeding from 5 bullet wounds, driving himself through the streets of Chicago because no one else was coming to help him. This is the story of Sergio Oliva, the greatest physique the sport of bodybuilding has ever produced, and one of the loneliest lives behind a body that looked untouchable. Before he became known as the Myth, he was a boy in Guanabacoa, a small district on the edge of Havana, working alongside his father in the sugarcane fields. There was no gym membership, no protein shake, no coach standing over him with a program. There was heat, exhaustion, and the kind of poverty that forces a 12-year-old to grow up quickly. He cut cane until his hands bled because that was what survival required. His family did not have the luxury of dreaming about a future in sports. They had the day in front of them, and that was enough of a fight. There was no talent scout watching his childhood, no one planning a path toward championships and endorsements. There was only the field, the heat, and the next day of work waiting behind it. Most people who go on to build the most famous physique on earth start with some advantage: a supportive system, money for food, time to train. Sergio started with none of that. He started with hunger, in every sense of the word. Though at 16 his father made a decision that would unsettle most parents today. There was no birth certificate to verify his real age, so when recruiters came looking for soldiers to fight for Batista's government, his father told them the boy was old enough. A teenager who should have been focused on school instead carried a rifle through a losing civil war. He rarely spoke about what he saw in that conflict, but the war shaped him in ways that stayed quiet and internal for the rest of his life. Part of why so many who met him later described him as guarded and serious, a man who did not let people in easily. When Batista fell to Castro's revolution, Sergio returned to a country that no longer had use for young men who had fought on the losing side. He drifted, spending his days at the beach because there was nowhere else for him to be. It was there that a stranger noticed his frame and invited him to a local weightlifting club. It was not destiny. It was the only door left open, and he walked through it because every other door in Cuba had already closed on him. Weightlifting became his way out, though not in a way anyone could have predicted. Within a single year of training, he was already lifting well over 400 pounds, a rate of progress that caught the attention of the Cuban government. They placed him on the national team and sent him to Jamaica in 1962 to compete at the Central American and Caribbean Games. It should have been the proudest moment of his young life. Instead, it became the moment he risked everything. While his guards were distracted, Sergio made a decision that could have led to imprisonment or worse if it had failed. He ran. He sprinted for the American consulate, and by the time anyone caught up to him, he was already inside, requesting asylum. He did not defect alone. 65 other Cuban athletes followed him that same day, inspired by a 19-year-old lifter who decided freedom was worth the risk of a bullet in the back. An entire national team effectively dissolved on foreign soil, and the story made headlines far beyond the sports pages because a group of athletes abandoning a government delegation in broad daylight was virtually unheard of. He did not simply find an exit for himself. He created one for everyone standing behind him. But defection has a price, and nobody warns you about it in advance. He landed in Miami with nothing. No money, no family nearby, no plan beyond surviving the next month. He found work fixing televisions, learning a trade on the fly because it was the only job available to a Cuban refugee with no connections and no safety net. He had no English and no cushion to fall back on if a job fell through. Every week was a negotiation between rent, food, and the training he refused to give up on, even when logic said he should have been putting all of his energy into simply staying afloat. In 1963, he moved north to Chicago, chasing more stable work. And it was there that his two parallel lives began, the machinist and the lifter, the man clocking into brutal manual labor jobs by day and pushing his body past its limits by night. Friends from that period remembered him arriving at the gym exhausted from a full shift, sometimes still smelling of the factory floor, and training anyway, because stopping was never an option he seriously considered. He worked in a Chicago foundry, where the heat rivaled the cane fields he had grown up cutting through as a child. He worked a meatpacking plant in bone-freezing cold, swinging between two extremes just to make rent every month. This was the daily life of the man who would soon be called the most genetically gifted bodybuilder who ever lived. And almost nobody watching him compete on stage had any idea. And his first bodybuilding title came in 1963 at the Mr. Chicagoland contest. He won Mr. Illinois in 1964 and placed in the EAU Junior Mr. America contests in 1965 and 1966, taking home the most muscular trophy both times even when he didn't win the overall title, because judges could not ignore what his body was doing even when the politics of the competition worked against him. Frustrated with what he felt was biased judging in the EAU ranks, He moved to the IFBB, a newer, less established federation at the time. It turned out to be the best decision of his career. He won the 1966 Mr. World title, then the 1967 Mr. Universe title, held alongside the Montreal World's Fair. By then, something had happened to his body that still doesn't have a full scientific explanation today, more than half a century later. His waist stayed locked at 27 inches while his chest expanded past 58. His arms and forearms reached measurements that no Mr. Olympia champion has matched since, even decades later, with better nutrition science, better training methods, and access to substances no one in 1968 had even heard of. Bodybuilders and historians still describe him as the most genetically gifted physique competitor who ever lived, a record that has survived nearly 60 years of the sport evolving around him. He won his first Mr. Olympia in 1967, and defended it in 1968 so convincingly that not a single competitor entered against him that year. A Guinness World Record that still stands today. Nobody wanted to walk on stage next to him. In 1969, he beat a rising 22-year-old bodybuilder from Austria in that competitor's first Olympia attempt. That young man's name was Arnold Schwarzenegger, and Arnold later stated in his own autobiography that the moment he saw Sergio backstage that night, his confidence evaporated on the spot. His pump disappeared. He felt physically smaller just standing near him. Sergio Oliva is the only man in history to beat Arnold Schwarzenegger at Mr. Olympia. Arnold went on to reclaim the title from him in a controversial 1970 rematch, one that many judges and fellow competitors at the time believed Sergio had actually won on the day. He rarely complained about it publicly. He simply kept training, kept showing up year after year as if the scoreboard mattered less to him than the work itself. That quiet response to what many considered a robbery only deepened the respect other bodybuilders had for him, even as it did nothing to fix the bank account he went home to every night. Almost nobody talks about this part of the story. While Arnold was becoming a global brand, with magazine covers, movie deals, and a household name recognized on every continent, Sergio was going home to a butcher's apron. Joe Weider, the man who controlled the sport's entire image machine at the time, did not consider Sergio marketable. He was a quiet, guarded black Cuban immigrant who did not speak fluent English, in an industry that was building its next global superstar around charisma, showmanship, and a camera-friendly personality. Sergio had the better body, arguably the better body the sport has ever seen. It did not matter. The machine picked someone else to sell to the world, and Sergio was left standing outside a system he had every right to be the face of. People who trained alongside him during that era often described a man who kept to himself, who let his physique do the talking because he had learned early on that talking had not gotten him very far in either Cuba or Chicago. Some called him sullen, others called him private. Almost nobody called him bitter, even though he had every reason to be. He simply kept showing up, kept lifting, kept adding size to a frame that already looked finished years before anyone else in the sport caught up to him. Historians of the era have pointed out that his personality, combined with the color of his skin and his accented English, made him a difficult sell for an industry that wanted its stars smiling on camera and fluent in sound bites. Sergio was not interested in performing off the platform. He performed on it, and expected that to be enough. In the world he was competing in, it was not. The greatest bodybuilder alive kept working a butcher's job just to survive. He would show up to warm up backstage at Mr. Olympia in his actual work uniform, blood-stained apron and all, because he had come straight from a shift at the shop. When a reporter once asked him why he wore it, he answered flatly that it was simply what he wore when he killed animals. He would then strip it off, step under the lights, and dismantle every competitor in the building. It has become a well-known story in bodybuilding history, repeated at parties and in documentaries as a badge of toughness. Looking past the glamour of the story though, it reveals something else. The most dominant physique of his era could not afford to skip a shift at the butcher counter on the day of the single biggest competition of his life. He trained at Chicago's Duncan YMCA, nicknamed the Muscle Factory, where crowds would gather just to watch him work out, drawn in by a body that looked almost unreal in person. He was already a local legend. He still could not pay his bills off of it. Needing something more stable than bodybuilding could offer him, Sergio took the Chicago Patrolman's exam in 1971. He spent time on a waitlist before securing a full-time position, and for more than 25 years he patrolled the streets of the city in a custom-tailored uniform built to fit a 60-inch chest, since nothing off the rack came close to fitting him. A man whose body broke world records that still stand today walked a beat through Chicago winters, mostly unrecognized by the people he passed on the sidewalk, because bodybuilding in that era simply didn't pay enough for a champion to live on. He answered calls, walked his assigned district, and did the same work as every other officer on the force, largely without his colleagues or the public making much of the fact that the man in the squad car had once outmuscled a future Hollywood action star on a world stage. The trophies kept piling up. The financial security never came. He wasn't just the greatest bodybuilder of his generation. He was a working-class immigrant clocking into a job most fans of the sport never knew he had. In 1986, the year that ended everything he'd spent 2 decades building, Sergio was preparing for a possible run at the US Olympic team, still training and still one of the most respected names in the sport even in the twilight of his competitive career. At home, an argument with his wife Arlene spiraled out of control. In the middle of the fight, the two struggled over his service revolver, the same weapon he carried every day as a police officer. The gun went off. Sergio was hit multiple times in the abdomen and rushed into serious condition, closer to death that night than he had ever come in any weight room or on any competition stage. Wounded and bleeding, he didn't wait for an ambulance to arrive. He got behind the wheel himself and drove through the streets of Chicago to reach the hospital. The man who could never rely on the sport to protect him financially also couldn't rely on anyone in the most dangerous moment of his life. He had to save himself, once more, entirely on his own. He survived, but nothing about his life afterward looked the same. His planned return to elite competition was gone. The marriage that had nearly cost him his life ended in divorce by 1990. Arlene left Chicago entirely, eventually building a separate career and life as an exercise physiologist in North Carolina. Sergio was left to raise his son largely on his own, and even that relationship carried its own weight for years to come. When his son Sergio Oliva Jr. grew old enough to pursue a bodybuilding career of his own, his father didn't celebrate the decision. He opposed it outright. The son who idolized him and wanted to walk the same path his father had walked was met not with pride but resistance. Sergio soon knew firsthand what the sport takes from a man long before it gives anything back, and he didn't want his own child paying that price too. Decades later, Sergio Jr. would speak openly about growing up in financial hardship despite being the son of a 3-time Mr. Olympia champion. A detail that reflects how little the fame of that era translated into stability for the men who earned it. 2 generations of the same family, 2 Mr. Olympia dreams, and neither came with the financial cushion most people assume follows a name like Oliva. He competed for the last time in 1984 and 1985, finishing 8th on both occasions, a quiet, statistically unremarkable ending for a man who had once won a world title completely unopposed. For years afterward, he remained a legend inside gyms and record books, largely outside the spotlight that had never fully embraced him in the first place. A character in the Japanese manga and anime series Baki the Grappler was closely modeled on his real-life appearance and personality, introducing a new generation to his legend decades after his prime, even if most of them never knew the man behind the inspiration. But his health began to decline in his later years. He required dialysis as his kidneys failed, a slow battle that had nothing to do with strength, willpower, or the discipline that had carried him through every other hardship in his life. There was no amount of discipline that could rebuild a failing kidney the way he had once rebuilt his own body from nothing in a Cuban weightlifting club. For a man whose entire identity had been built around physical dominance, watching that same body decline in his 70s played out mostly outside public view, far from the cameras and magazine covers that had never quite found room for him. On November 12, 2012, at the age of 71, Sergio Oliva died in a Chicago area hospital from kidney failure, becoming the first Mr. Olympia champion in the sport's history to pass away. Arnold Schwarzenegger, his old rival turned lifelong friend, posted a public tribute calling him one of the greatest bodybuilders of all time and a true friend. It was a rare moment where the industry that had overlooked him for decades acknowledged him with the reverence he had long deserved. By then, he was not there to hear it. Sergio Oliva built a body that challenged what people believed was physically possible for a human being to achieve. He did it while working double shifts in a foundry, patrolling city streets through harsh Chicago winters, having survived a war he was too young to have been sent to fight, having defected from the only country he had ever known with nothing but the clothes on his back, and having nearly died at the hands of someone who was supposed to be his partner for life. The story of Sergio Oliva was never really about losing the Olympia title to Arnold Schwarzenegger in 1970. It is that a man who gave everything to become the greatest never received the life that should have accompanied that achievement. He earned the records, he earned the nickname, he earned the quiet respect of everyone who ever stood next to him and understood exactly what they were looking at. What he did not receive was the safety net, the marketing machine, or the piece that should have followed a legacy as large as his. He earned all of it the hardest way possible, and in the end he earned most of it largely alone. Greatness, even the kind that reshapes an entire sport, does not automatically come with protection. It does not guarantee support when the moment becomes dangerous. Sergio Oliva spent much of his life demonstrating that the strongest man in the room can still be the one without anyone watching out for him.